first of all, let's talk about the introduction that I really did not do a good job of. So there's CNET as well. Can you please do a better job of some of the highlights? Because I just, I rarely actually bring the bio of the person that I'm introducing, because I can usually sum it up in 2 or 3 sentences, but there's just so much here. So please.
Sure. So I have lived in New York for most of my life. I left to go to college and met someone here this evening who seemed to have been in the same area that I was at the same time. But in any case, I've had a long career basically in the world of content, is what I think of it now. I moved back to New York. I was a publisher for some years. In those days, used to call it a publisher. Now you call it a content producer, and was involved in a variety of very traditional magazines, publications, marketing. Went back to school years after having gotten a degree in history, and got an MBA, because at that time it was really clear that if you had an MBA, you could make 3 times the money you were currently earning. And that proved to be the case. And then I met Esther Dyson, and Esther and I were business partners for 18 years, actually, and we built a company called Adventure Holdings. We published a business-to-business report on technology called Release 1.0, and produced a conference called PC Forum, which was kind of before TED, was kind of the preeminent executive gathering.
And that was before Internet.com as well, right?
Yeah, yes, it was. It
so
was pre-Internet.
Meckler copied you?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but yeah. But it was, it was a gathering of about 500 people every year. It really was the movers and shakers of the industry. The attendees were, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mitch Kapor, and the people who went on to build great companies. And our job was to both provide great content and to showcase emerging technologies and companies. And I'm struck these days when one looks at, the pitch day at accelerators, very much sort of similar to what we did in those days, where we would have, content sessions, and then the afternoon would be filled with other entrepreneurs and VCs, and companies would get to, showcase their companies.
That was based in New York always?
No, we always did it, because we were based in New York, and it was in the winter. We always did it someplace warm, so that was our strategy. And generally in Arizona, a couple of times in California. And, so AOL, Steve Case showcased AOL there. ICQ, which was the original instant messaging program, launched at our conference. Lotus met IBM, Flickr met Yahoo, that kind of. So it was that type of event. It was great. It was a great conference. It was really fun. And then in addition, we were very interested in the early 90s in Eastern Europe, and had a conference business in that part of the world that was much more market-focused on emerging markets in Eastern Europe, and was also a terrific experience, really a labor of love. After the wall had come down, and there were actually all these incredible entrepreneurs, and huge amount of technical talent, and an opportunity to kind of leapfrog and really bypass any legacy, because there was no legacy, and really put in some very modern technologies. And a lot of innovations come out of Eastern Europe, as we know. So it was a great time, and we had a publication as well, and did that work basically until September 11th, and then kind of abandoned that because it just got too hard to do a conference in Europe. But and then we decided that it was time to have a larger partner, and so Esther and I sold the company to CNET Networks in 2004. Both stayed long enough to do our earnout, and then we both left. And so
is that the exit story? Is that your favorite exit?
It's my most lucrative exit, so I suppose might make it my favorite. I don't know, yeah, I mean, it was very interesting, and for us it was very interesting because we had built a subscription-based business where people paid for content. And we didn't have advertising. We did at our events, we invited emerging companies to provide services to our attendees, which was essentially, I guess, a form of sponsorship, though we made them pay to attend as well, but it was an opportunity to showcase their wares. And we were interested, I mean, I was particularly interested in sort of having a business that was of the web and kind of born of the web, which CNET was, that was advertising based, and to see where that would go. And for me, certainly, it was a great learning experience, though when all was said and done, I decided not to stay, and there's lessons from that as well.
So was there a woman early in your life, or was there somebody early in your life that got you on, sort of directed in a business direction? Because, still we're struggling with the issue of women in business,
Yeah.
but here was early 80s, and you were
Yeah.
going straight for it.
My mom was a businesswoman, so I think that's part of it, certainly.
What did she do?
She was in sales, and
Right.
she had a great balance because she worked for a photographic lab and sort of got to work with photographers and also do production and sell and to advertising agencies. And
Right.
so I'm sure that influenced me in some way. I think that, and I also came of age at a time.
Right.
Feminism was very important. I actually got a bachelor's degree in women's history, and at a time when that was a sort of changing period in terms of history and how history was taught and studied and researched, where it was as much about methodology as it was about the content, sort of the emergence of social history, which we take for granted now, but was not the way history had been told in the past,
Right.
and where it was much more periodized by events that were led by women, rather than the advent of birth control or the whatever it might be that actually very much changed the texture of society. So that was kind of an important early stage kind of involvement that I had. And then, as I said to someone here, the college I went to was also a very new experimental college, and it was a startup at the time, essentially. And so I think that the opportunity to see how to as students be part of creating what the institution became. I've recently reflected on that. It was actually very influential in terms of early on kind of the notion that you do and then you ask for forgiveness after, which is
Right.
now, of course,
It's
the
kind of what you have
entrepreneurs.
going with Catalyst right now
Right, exactly. Yeah.
as a
So,
startup.
right. And so I think that was just early on kind of my experience. And again, I've recently reflected on sort of, there's a pattern here, which, but so that was it. And then in the years since,
Yeah.
I've spent the time mostly sitting on several boards, doing strategic and advisory work, working on a couple of projects that are sort of big meta stuff for foundation, and being active in Golden Seeds.
Right.
And
So if you were going to name one or two business people that have forced you to reflect or have been kind of the most influential, or you look at it and say, hey, that's really somebody that's impressive, who would you name?
Well, look, I think, Marissa Mayer is a really interesting model these days for women. She embodies a lot. There's a lot of criticism, but here's someone who has both that tech background,
Right.
and real training, and understands business. Didn't necessarily get all the credit at Google, but really built user experience in
Right.
some way, and I
Right.
think has been very influential in really establishing how critically important that is to the technology experience that we all have. I think that there's a challenge there. Her predecessor, Carol Bartz, was a really important, similarly, someone who built Autodesk, a sort of under-recognized multi-billion-dollar company that is hugely important in terms of, virtually every building that exists in terms of film technology. And Autodesk is the CAD/CAM world, and she built that business
Right.
very successfully. She will unfortunately probably be remembered as the failed CEO of Yahoo, and I think we could talk about that. I think that that's something that is harder for women than it is for men.
Right. Right.
You can screw up HP and you get to run something else when you're done. So
Right.
I do think that that's still an issue. So I think she's a really important. I
Yeah.
think there are a lot of startups that women led. It's the environment is different now.
Right.
Certainly, and I think business skills, I think part of why we're seeing a change is because business skills are increasingly important,
Right.
and women may not have the
How many
tools.
people have a startup? Put your hand up if you have a startup.
Great.
How many people have a question for Daphne? Put your hand up if you have a question. Okay, well, everybody's going to have a question because I'm going to point to you. But you have a question.
I have lots of questions, and actually it was interesting to hear your introduction, since I spent 18 years in publishing myself, also in New York. So maybe it's a good place to start if you're going to go be an entrepreneur. But one of the questions I would have is, as you're watching women entrepreneurs evolve, what do you think some of the biggest challenges are for them as they're moving into this space? Because they're still underrepresented in the startup space, and why is that? And what are some of the observations around what the extra challenges are for women entrepreneurs?
So I think, I had in my pocket somewhere, there's some stats that just came out recently, how much angel investing has increased for women, but the reality it's still 12% or something of angel investing is invested in women-led companies. And I think that...
So I think Paul Graham said 8.9,
yeah.
And then they're at 16 in his blog post reads.
Right.
So
I'm telling you, 16. It's really,
yeah.
So I think that there are I think there are specific challenges that women face. What I've seen being involved in Angel Group and investing in women-led companies is that women often, and certainly in the environment we're in now, tend to come to it perhaps a little bit later than a lot of guys do. So they might go and work for a company and then go, hey, I got a great idea, I'm going to go out and do this. But they first feel compelled to get a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge. That's great in terms of actually building a successful business. What's not great about it is that, and we've seen this at Golden Seeds repeatedly, is that they're coming to the game a little bit later. And by then, they have obligations and responsibilities. So one of my lines is, they're not 22 years old living in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and doing their laundry once a month. They have other obligations. And I think that makes it very challenging. So it's very hard for them to work for just equity. So I think that's a huge part of just a just tactical thing that happens.
Can I then kind of take that a little bit further?
Yes.
And this is one of the things I often think about. That's true in terms of younger entrepreneurs and being able to work for the equity.
Yes.
And you're right. I think that we probably see a dip in entrepreneurship for anybody that's got a young family, has got their mortgage going, and all of those things. Either way. But what about the over 45 or over 50 women? So now they don't have those responsibilities anymore. They've got all this experience, and many of them are looking to start businesses.
Yes.
What kind of trend are you seeing for those types of entrepreneurs? And is the startup space supportive of that type of entrepreneur?
I think that there are certainly quite a few women, and they actually, to your point, yes, they've built careers, and they have a lot of domain expertise that they're now eager to take out into the marketplace and build businesses, and they see problems and they envision solutions for them. I think that another one of my lines is that when I came of age, you graduated from college, you took 6 months off, you went backpacking in Europe, and you got a job. Now you graduate from college and you do a startup, okay? And it's really the way it goes. You see this in New York now. It's in an epidemic proportion. We can talk about that too, whether that's a good thing or not. But so I think that and I do think that women come to it later. A lot of women do have domain expertise, and the environment certainly rewards younger people now in terms of their understanding. I think there's a little bit that's changing, in that there are now. Those women do have business experience, and there is kind of a little bit of a pivot that it's not just about technology. It's actually about knowing how to build businesses, and I do think that that's actually probably influencing why it went from 9 to 18%, which is sort of related to another trend, which is that not everybody can be Snapchat, and not everybody, right? And so,
although the 18%, to be clear, is just Y Combinator.
Yes, no, I understand.
Right,
I do
and
understand.
it's 8.9%, I think, for angel investing in women.
Right,
generally.
right. That statistic presumably just changed to 12, but
Yeah, okay.
But the or whatever it is, it's still not significant,
Right.
statistically
Not
significant
50-50.
enough. It's certainly not 50-50 or 25-75. So, but the issue was partly well, there's just a lot of, they're very interrelated and intertwined. So I think there is now a little bit of a shift to rewarding women who do have business experience. The technology's also changed in the last 3 years. I can tell you that 3 years ago, at a place like Golden Seeds, when we would see young women who came, or slightly older women who came with great business experience, but they couldn't find technical co-founders. It was like impossible. And so they were so disadvantaged. They were building not technology companies, they were building technology-enabled companies. And they could not find technical co-founders to do that. I think there's a little bit of a shift to that in that realm, and that's creating an opportunity for women who may not have that technical background and who are, that's again a separate issue, but are very underrepresented in terms of being engineers and having the computer science talent that's needed and the developer talent.
And why would they have trouble finding those technical co-founders?
Because it is ageist in that way, and because, you know,
It's also hard. I mean, it's hard to find a
it's hard
technical
for anybody to find it,
right?
but I think a lot of those, you know, there is a sort of the tale of how these companies are founded. It's, you know, two guys who meet in college, and one of them has a really great business idea, and the other is, you know, he took a computer science course with, and so they go out and they come. I mean, that story, you hear it over and over again. You hear it coming out of Stanford, you hear it coming out of Cornell, you hear it coming out of Yale.
Yeah.
It's not. So I think that part of it is just, you know, it's the communities you're in. So how are you going to find what you need if you're, and again, when the technology is very rewarded, that's fine. When the business starts to get rewarded, I'd like to think that represents an opportunity for it to pivot a little bit.
So you have 18 companies in the
In the
program?
Imagination Catalyst,
And
yes.
how many are female founded?
We have 4 that are
Four.
female founded.
Mhm.
So it's, which is interesting because OCAD, as I mentioned, our student body is 70%, our faculty are much more skewed towards,
Right.
are much higher in women. So.
Women. Yeah.
So we're focused on this, on the theme of women in tech or women founding. Is there anybody that has a question along that theme? You know, go ahead.
I do. Hi, I'm Judy Bloomstock from Bunny Ears, and I'm probably about your age, I'm just guessing from the general history that you've given. And ironically enough, sitting here kind of going, okay, what's next for Bunny Ears TV? We really do need some technical skills that we've been trying to scrape together.
What is Bunny Ears?
Sorry?
What is Bunny Ears?
It's a highly curated web TV station for young children.
Okay.
And actually a lot of the content is from Hungary. But be that as it may, so what I was going to ask was, when you do find that technical co-founder or person that you can partner with, whether it's paid or unpaid or what have you, do you have any hints for how to work with? Because there is sort of a generation gap almost, and do you have any experience with what works and what doesn't work, trying to sort of get that to work a little bit better?
Right. Well, I think that one of the things that helps, in those, well, what I get just empirically seen, is that if you then have if they have cohorts who are not necessarily you, I mean, you're sort of the business leader, but they have, you know, peers, their own peers, and cohorts within the company, that helps a lot. So that it doesn't, so there are examples where, you know, the leadership may be somewhat older and, again, perhaps more business focused or more, have very particular domain expertise. But the younger developers, if they're, you know, the person who's doing social media and the person who's doing, you know, or their peers, that you can create an ecosystem where it's not just defined by you, but it's kind of from the bottom up, as it were.
Right.
And that, I've seen that in instances that helps a lot.
So just sort of, you know, stand back and let them do their thing, and that's the culture of the company that you allow.
Yeah,
to
that you,
work with.
right. And which I actually think in general, there's stuff about that, I mean, to your question earlier, is sometimes perhaps an issue when older women who've been in, whether it's corporate settings or very traditional business settings, and are trying to figure out what kind of culture to create that will innovate. Okay, and you know, sometimes that's a challenge for those women as well, right? Who are in leadership positions and might have had most of their professional training in some other particular disciplined environment that's in a particular way. So, but certainly if you're building something whose goal it is to be adaptive and open and iterative, then we have something to learn from how the younger population works and their work styles, right? Of course, on the other hand, then there's these videos that are out there that are so funny about, you know, how you get them to show up. kind of like before 11, and you know how they're always used. They spent their whole childhood being rewarded all the time, so you have to tell them all the time that they're just,
Or you could
oh
be
my
like
God,
Melissa.
you're awesome, and oh my God, you're.
You could just like be like Melissa at Yahoo and just say, okay, that's it. Everybody who's at the office has a job, and the people who are working
Yeah,
remotely
well, that's a
don't.
more complex discussion, and that has its, you know.
Okay, another female-oriented question or along the
Yeah,
theme.
mine's really around financing,
Sorry.
kind of Vicky Saunders from GEO. So with Golden Seeds, you've been at it for a while, I think 7 years or a little more than a year.
The Golden Seeds have been around for nearly since 2005, I think it is. I've been involved since about 2007
Okay.
And they've deployed $58 million
in women-led.
in women-led companies.
So is there something different? Is there something different that you notice about the model that you guys use in terms of how you're financing? Is there a different approach? Is there something missing that needs to be shared more broadly, globally, around best practices around that?
Well, this is a slightly, bigger answer. But one of the things, so there's a kind of an interesting story around Golden Seeds. So a lot of the women who founded Golden Seeds came from financial services. Stephanie, the woman who founded, had been at J.P. Morgan, a banker for many years. Did very well, but came to the glass ceiling and basically decided that the way to actually change the calculation was to support women-led companies and create the next generation of wealth by companies where women grew and built their own entities, and then would essentially pay forward in some way and create more companies in the future that would be led by women, rather than asking for permission to innovate within some other women, male, controlled entity. And that was its original premise. It's evolved over the years very much. The original people in Golden Seeds, many of them came from financial services. And so they brought a discipline to it that actually is one of the kind of unique characteristics of Golden Seeds. So a lot of groups, angel groups, want to invest with Golden Seeds because it's known for doing such great due diligence. So whereas, a lot of angel groups are kind of like, well, looks good, let's try it and see what happens. And so that's been an important contribution, actually, that Golden Seeds has made to the, ACA would credit Golden Seeds a lot with creating some discipline around angel investing, which, to the extent that it does mitigate risk, I don't know. I mean, it's a little hard to measure in terms of outcomes, but has certainly been a contributor and been important. And from my own personal experience, actually, I last year I was in Tunisia and I was in Egypt teaching the curriculum that Golden Seeds had developed with a cohort, and it was really interesting because you had something that was very structured, and there were angel groups in Cairo and in Tunis who were looking to invest in their countries, and they were very interested in the curriculum because it was giving structure to how to think about angel investing. And that its own challenges. I mean, you have to convince them that 90%, you can't own 90% of the company because then they're the entrepreneur is your employee, they're not an entrepreneur. You have to incentivize them. Of course, if you incentivize them, you have to give them equity, and then how do you value something that hasn't been built yet? So it was really, really interesting. But I think that some of that has actually contributed to opening angel investing and the idea of angel investing to people who would not otherwise have considered investing. So I think that's been an really important contribution that Golden Seeds has made to the sort of general angel ecosystem. I think that the issue of understanding that there are older, sometimes women who are starting companies, is something that, so there is sort of salary built in at the outset. It's not just equity in many of the cases, not in all cases, but an understanding that needs to be part of how the deal is structured. Perhaps sometimes some of those entities have done a better job because they do have a broader support network of having done a friends and family round, so they come to Golden Seeds having already achieved that. And I think just in general, part of the lines have gotten blurred. So what used to be an angel deal is now really a round. I mean, it's not, people expect you to, if you're going to go raise money, you don't have 250,000 users, right?
Yeah.
Well, come back when you have, all right, and it's not. So And that's been a challenge in some instances. So I think that's a meaningful way that it's contributed.
And how does Golden Seeds recruit new membership? It's the third largest investor network in the United States now, is it not?
Angel Group.
Angel Group,
if not
yeah.
the second, I think. So
Oh, second or third?
I think so. I don't know. They're active in New York. The largest
Yeah.
group is in New York. There's a very active group in Boston. There's an active group in the Valley now, and in Dallas there's also a group that's very active. Recruiting members has really been a word of mouth. I mean, and you know, I think that that you have and women, and by the way, 20% of the group are men. You know, otherwise known as the Golden Dudes, and you know, who see and understand that the metrics are out there, that companies in which there is diversity, which is ultimately the point, right? In which there is diversity, tend to be more successful companies. The stats are in. Kaufman Foundation, a whole lot of organizations have done this research, and the evidence is there, and it's clear that diverse companies do better.
Right.
Now, and by the way, in Golden Seeds, it's not that there has to be a woman in a leadership position who owns a meaningful equity stake. Might have been diluted by now,
Right.
but a significant equity stake.
Are they doing deals in Canada?
There were a couple of deals that were done in Canada in the past. I'd say out of the portfolio, I know of one, there may be two. But, you know, part of it, and that, of course, that has a different set of challenges.
So if you need
just
like a
for-
great female-led company over the next 24
Oh,
hours.
yeah, sure. Well, you tell them to come to New York and incorporate in Delaware. No,
We have a lower tax rate now.
Yes, I know. I know.
Okay.
I know.
well, as
Believe
long
me,
as
I
we're
know.
clear.
And all those grants. I mean, they're.
So one of the questions that, okay, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
just had a question just along the lines of what you were just talking about on the data. So the Startup Genome project has been going on in the States for a number of years. A lot of study of entrepreneurship in general and what are the success factors. You know, multi-founders more successful than single founders.
Right.
Amount of capital at different points in time.
Mhm.
So you've got enough data to sort of looked at women founded or women predominantly in enterprises. Can you talk a bit about how you see that data being different or the same as in terms of outcomes? And the kind of filters you apply when you look at an investment decision for one
Right.
fund investment?
So, without overgeneralizing, I think that one of the issues is often that women-led sort of, it's that anthropological study that I want to conduct in the future. But I think that women are used to managing, whether it's families or groups of people. And so my experience is that a lot of these companies that come, they tend to be, you have to sort of convince them that they actually have a bigger business than they have. And, you know, to the extent that we all know that business plans are, you know, fantasy or projection of a reality that may or may not happen. Sometimes I've seen that some of these companies, the women-led companies, have a smaller view of what they're able to do than they should. All right? That if, in fact, they put the right team together and have the right resources, there's no reason why they can't grow a very large and very successful business. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, they tend to be revenue-driven. And so I think that actually one of the things, and this again, I think there's a convergence that's happening that hopefully will benefit women, is that in general, angel groups and investors are coming to understand that, again, not everything can be Snapchat. So you can build a $50 million business that gets acquired to the extent that the big companies out there are basically turning to startups to do their R&D, which is sort of the world we live in now, right? That these can become acquisition targets, where you can actually build something, whether it's, a content company that is looking for a vertical that it hasn't successfully penetrated, or it's a technology, some enabling technology that Mark Zuckerberg, every penny he paid for Instagram, it was worth it, okay, because he bought mobile, basically. That's what he bought, right? By buying Instagram in the form of photos, right? So again, if you build the right thing and you can then find the strategic for whom that adds value, I think that the convergence of that generally in the angel world, and as it applies to women, may present a new kind of opportunity. And I think, again, angel groups are looking at monetization and ROI opportunities that are in that smaller, whether they're 25 million or they're 200 million. Not all of them are 3 billion.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Go ahead, Amanda, is it?
Yep. I was wondering, what is a great pitch to you? What are the elements? Do you have any tips? You or other angel investors? I've never done it, so. Business plan? Really detailed?
Well, I think detailed business plans, but again, I mean, this is my personal view. I mean, business plans are really important, and the reason they're important more than anything else is not because you got the numbers right, or because you understand what's at play, all right? And you're understanding a dynamic about, well, if you do this, then this impacts, this outcome, that it is a dynamic. I mean, a spreadsheet may be the most two-dimensional thing, but the inputs in it are ideally really, really dynamic. And I think that in terms of, as an angel investor, assessing that is the value that a business plan and modeling it offers, okay, with the understanding that that is going to change and I don't know of any startup where it doesn't change. But I like to say that it's part of it is it's an expression of people's business skill. It's an expression of their ability to focus, okay, because I also think that it's really important to not, say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, all right, but really because you want to know that somebody can prove a concept and then kind of, work from the circle out, as it were, whether it's in other verticals or it's whatever it might be that the business has to change. But to prove a core value, I think, is the point. I also think the ability to say it, you know all that stuff, the 10-page blah, 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 put it in the appendix. I mean, there's all that stuff. But again, I think the exercise of that is the point. And the point is to be able to really articulate what your business does and its value proposition. And one of the things that's a real challenge in angel groups, which is different than institutional investors, where you're sort of targeting different kind of investors who probably have domain expertise in what you're trying to pitch, is that, angels it's a passion, all right? It's not, so people tend to relate to what they can understand and what they feel passionate about, which is the blessing and the curse, right, as it were. Because if they are passionate about it, then they're going to do everything they can to help you. Oh, I met this, you should talk to this, kind of be helpful to you in terms of growing your business at a very early stage. On the other hand, in angel groups, you have people, again, it tends to be sort of a projection of themselves in some way, or what they understand or what they feel. It's slightly less disciplined, perhaps, than other kinds of investing, arenas. And so that's why it becomes particularly important to really be able to articulate the value proposition so someone for whom it's not native can understand the value. And then, ideally, has the discipline to say, well, I may not be the target audience, but I get that this is happening. I get that, a young audience needs well-managed, curated television for a very young, and I can understand, what works, what doesn't work, what formats. And that, does that make sense? Does that answer?
Just coming back to the, sorry, I'll go ahead. Coming back to the incorporation in Delaware, you realize that if you invest here, we can get the government to match your investment.
Yes, I know that.
Did you hear about that?
Yes. Well, let's start a Golden Seeds in Toronto. That's the way to do it, right? Because, part of the challenge, honestly. I mean, a lot of the investments, it's not, the New York group may lead an investment that's in Colorado. It's not that all of it are New York-based companies. But I do think that it does matter to have champions and to really understand what the local factors are at play that would, I mean, when I was in Tunisia and Egypt, people say, oh, will you invest? It's like, no, because, I think it's why people invest in funds, for example, because they now have, they can have a surrogate who understands the landscape and what it takes to get those grants.
Right.
That you have. I mean, as I said to you earlier, I spent several years on the board of a company in Montreal, and ironically, as the American, I was chairing the compensation committee, which was kind of a joke, because in the United States, you know, if you work a month, you can fire somebody. You can't, and here, somebody worked for a month, and it's like, so we've got to give them 3 months severance. And I was like, are you kidding? You know, you would never do that in the U.S. You'd like, you know, here's a pen and, you know, take the next holiday on us. I mean, that would be the extent of it. So I think that there's a lot of, you know, that, and something like that probably has an impact on a funding scenario, and it's sort of use of funds once you raise money, for example, or, you know, whatever it might be.
So one of the questions that evolved, we did this, started this conversation in June. We did it at Ryerson University. Vicki chaired the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions was, should something like Golden Seeds exist in Canada or in Ontario?
Everywhere.
So why, you know, so what are the top 3 reasons? What are the key reasons why you really need a women's investor network in order to address the problem?
Well, again, I think that ultimately, if one says the long-term goal is to build diverse companies, somebody has to champion that, okay? It doesn't happen on its own. And so ultimately, that's why, okay? The long-term goal is not just to have companies that are filled with women. That's not the point. The point is to change the culture of companies, to create as much opportunity as possible. I don't know much about it, but my sense is that Toronto, you know, the scene in New York it's been exploded in the last few years.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many people who have a lot of money, and they're interested in investing money.
Mm-hmm.
Some for a personal ROI, a mission-driven ROI. Some because they're trying to diversify and deploy their capital in a range of ways,
Mm-hmm.
which creates a huge
Mm-hmm.
opportunity. And so they're just endless investors in New York.
Right, so
okay?
let's talk about the emergence of New York then for a moment.
Yes, sure.
So we had Howard Morgan here, who
My good friend Howard.
good friend Howard,
Yeah.
and we asked the question about what's the key to the emergence of New York, who recently surpassed Boston as being sort of a
Yes.
leading investment startups, the second largest next to
Mm-hmm.
Silicon Valley. So what do you
Yeah.
feel? What do you feel are the keys to the emergence of New York as a startup ecosystem?
So a lot of it has to do with some of what I said earlier, which is that it's more about business and less about technology. So New York had some incredibly important international businesses, from fashion to publishing to financial services. In 2008, I haven't checked this statistic out, but I remember being told at the time that there were actually more developers in New York in the back office of the financial services industry than there were in all of Silicon Valley. Now, when this dip happened, some of them came out of the woodwork and sort of found the entrepreneur in their heart. And some didn't and have become developers. Some went on to do all sorts of other things. So that actually, that was the silver lining in terms of what happened with the financial services, not demise, but the sort of configuration of financial services. And that segued at the same time. You had industries that were very strong in New York, traditional industries that had not yet benefited from technology. Publishing being a very obvious one. You know, where the New York Times is losing all of its circulation, has half of its net revenue, and has to find a way to become a digital media company. That's true of them, it's true of Sony, it's true of film world, it's in all the sort of television. And then certainly in the world of fashion is another really great example. There is an enormous amount happening in the fashion tech space in New York.
You've got some investments in fashion?
I do.
What?
I'm involved in a company called Style for Hire,
Okay.
which is co-founded by a woman named Stacey London, who had a TV show called What Not to Wear for many years.
That's right.
And it's a
I
platform.
remember that one.
It's a platform for fashion stylists. So, we're trying to figure it out. It's a hard nut to crack.
Anybody got fashion related startup here? There's one over there.
Right.
Okay.
So in the last few years, since we made that investment, there's some place in between that's leveraging technology and yet at the same time creating a kind of personalized, customized experience that women and men are looking for in a world in which they have more choices than ever, but aren't necessarily making better choices. So again, huge opportunity. And that's coupled with, I'd say in the last 18 months, retailers understanding that actually they're not going away necessarily, but they have to create some hybrid model in which people get the benefit of the online, seamless online experience coupled with an in-store experience in which they get to touch and feel and make choices, and it's a social part of what people do. So again, there's sort of how that's all going to fall out, who knows, but you know, there's a reason why Walmart's going online and Amazon now makes it easy for you to go to the coffee shop around the corner and drop off your book instead of having to go to the post office, right? So they're creating physical presence.
Go ahead.
Right?
So my question is about women as investors.
Yeah.
So my sense has been, I do a little bit of investing. I'm not, I have a background in it, and I don't think there's a magic to due diligence. I think that you need curiosity, you need some skills. But I have a lot of really, really bright friends, and when I say to them that this is what I do, they go, "Oh my gosh, how can you do that?" And I think to myself, it's not rocket science. And I like your sort of sense of women as investors. How, you know, is their risk profile different? How do we bring women of means and even at the sort of mid-level, how do we bring them into this environment?
Right. Well, that's a great and important question. I think there's a group in the U.S. called Pipeline, and what Natalie, the founder of that, has done, which is really smart, is women give away money all the time, right? They're great philanthropists, but they don't expect a return on their investment. And certainly some of what's happening in Canada, from what I understand in terms of social entrepreneurship, actually creates a great opportunity. But again, that requires an education in which you, and this is what Pipeline has done, is take women who traditionally have been philanthropic and kind of teach them how to become angel investors. And she's done it in a whole bunch of cities. It's really important work. You know, are women more risk adverse? I think they ask more questions. And so once you start asking more questions, by the time you're done, you're like, you know, you can talk yourself out of anything, right? So that may be part of the challenge. But I think that there is an issue, and women perhaps need, and again, this is sort of why I was saying that with Golden Seeds, I've given structure to some of that. And, you know, and I would argue that it would be worth, if you have a group of women who are interested in investing, that learning some of the sort of just tools or the vocabulary of that arena, which has been very traditionally male-dominated, would probably be a great first step to having them consider doing some angel investing. And again, I think there are the whole question of social entrepreneurship and how you measure success and how you measure ROI. There's a lot of work, as we all know, being done about that, and I think there's a huge opportunity moving forward where women will, both the organizations and women in terms of making their philanthropic decisions, will look at organizations and try and assess, you know, sort of a double bottom line and how they're. But I think it's just a matter of education more than anything else is what the short answer.
Go ahead.
Just on that same topic, I'm curious if you think there's a difference in terms of women and their desire to create wealth or the aversion to creating wealth.
I don't think women are opposed to creating wealth at this stage. I mean,
I don't know.
No, it's a fair question. But again, I think the question is what definition of success is. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, it is a challenge. I mean, I think that there are women are not. I can't make a generalization, honestly. I think there are a lot of women who just want to accumulate as much wealth as possible so they can do whatever it is, so they can have a jet or a yacht or whatever it might be.
I've met them in Toronto.
I haven't really met them in New York either. All right. I mean, I think that, but I do think that.
But definition of success, I think that's
really
it.
the key. That is the key, and I think.
I don't think it's a jet. I think it's getting home, having a business run while you're home.
There's certainly.
Well, I think yes and no. I think it's different for different women, and I think that now, You know, I mean, in New York, for example, you know, de Blasio just won. Part of why he won was on the notion that there should be free pre-K daycare. Okay, now the Europeans may be laughing because they've had that for a while. Perhaps the Canadians are as well. That's a big radical
We
no,
missed
right?
that one.
Sort, but
We
that's
keep screwing up.
yeah. But I don't know enough to know. But I, you know, certainly the French are laughing. I mean, it's
Yes,
not, you know.
yes.
So, but again, I think that is, you know, catching up with that reality. There was some article I read in the Atlantic, I think, recently that was talked about paternity leaves, and just, you know, changing that law, as it were.
We have that here.
Right. Okay. Well, that, you know, and that the big data that suggests that the earlier men are involved, the more likely that'll be true when your kid is 5 and 10. So, you know, I mean, I had a business for years. I had 2 young daughters. The thought of it now makes me so tired. I can't, you know, and it was like nonstop. And then I had, you know, like 20 whatever employees who were young and ambitious, and it was, you know, I didn't sleep for years, all right? And it wasn't, and, you know, and I have some tricks about that. I really come to like sleep.
Oh, really?
It's a really great, it's really important. But in any case, I think, you know, and there's some tricks to that trade. I mean, I always say one of my things for women entrepreneurs is that if you're going to work at home, you should work at home on Tuesdays. That's my thing. I really believe that. So you don't, if you're working all the time and you want to be there you have to be there on Monday and Friday, just like everybody else, or people think you're working part-time. And you don't want to be out on Wednesday because then it kind of divides up the week. But if you're not, if you work from home on Tuesday, then the week is still building momentum. And it's like you went to a conference that day. But by the time you get back on Wednesday, there's still enough left of the week to get something done.
That's tactical education right
So,
there.
and it worked really well for me. It was really important. It was really, and you know, I worked, but my staff knew that 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, I was in the schoolyard picking up my kids to take her to dance class. That's just the way it was going to be.
Go ahead.
Weiner's question.
Okay, go ahead.
Grab that first.
Sorry, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Sure. So my name's Brendan. I go to school and work for a startup in Boston. My question is about deal flow at Golden Seeds. Quick 2-part question. First, does the deal flow go up from analysts on upwards or down from your managing directors, or just kind of from everywhere? And then the second part is, what gets your attention within the deal flow tunnel, whether it be pedigreed founders, a connection to some of the angels or whatnot?
Well, you answered it, but yeah. So Golden Seeds has a pretty democratic, you know, a lot of basically unpaid labor to to figure out what to look at and what to put through the pipeline. We have a screening. We meet for screening once a month. As many people as possible show up. Some people very much are regulars, and I happen to be someone who loves screening because you really got to see sort of what's out there. Excuse me, before you filter it too much. And, you know, just you see the diversity of ideas that are happening. People tend to sort of have, based on their domain expertise, go in the tech room or the consumer room and so on. It's a very democratic process. You fill out the application, you come, and if you've done that and it meets the requirements, then you come to screening. And then the group of people, based on what everybody sort of within their own room makes recommendations of what should come to forum. And then the whole group comes together and decides what should be presented to the larger group later in the month when there is a monthly forum. Certainly, a pedigree matters a lot. Domain expertise does matter. A vision depends where. I mean, there's, you know, some people care more that if there's already some revenue being generated. Others just care that it's a big idea, pre-revenue.
What do you care?
I don't really care that much about. I mean, I care about big ideas and opportunity, and I think that one of the issues, and this is often true in angel groups, is that they're sort of underfunded from the outset, and that there is a tendency to, so people end up kind of having to think smaller than they would like to think,
Right.
because they're very driven by having some proof of concept that's actually about revenue rather than about users or about some other market measure of potential success. So But yes, all of that matters. And again, I don't think it has to be that you went to business school, but some real understanding of the dynamics of your business and your learnings is really what matters. So, and again, you have a group with hundreds of people in it. So some people, there's no way to sort of say, well, it's just this or it's just that. There is, again, in the due diligence you're right, there is mechanics to due diligence, but I also think there's a bit of an art to due diligence if you do it right, which is not just about the numbers or about the reference, but is about a vision of what it could become. And one of the things that matters, this is also a hard thing, I think, as an angel investor or for any investor, is that fine balance between coachability and tenacity. I think that's really important. So you want someone who's just not going to give it up, right? Like they're just determined to make it happen. But on the other hand, has the ability to hear what other people, has a good filter for listening and taking feedback, but doesn't, it's not just a sieve that kind of just, it all goes in, is really able to be discerning about it, but is coachable in some way.
So here, sorry, Grant and then Margot, right?
Hi, my name is Grant. This is my co-founder, Amanda.
Hi, Amanda.
Our company is called parkbench.com. We're a neighborhood-focused business and social network, trying to encourage people to shop local, help local businesses get awareness and get businesses without having a budget, and sort of redefining, what it's meant to have all the stuff that's in the neighborhood online. Two-part question. One, for a startup that's starting to make money and can see kind of continual, growth if they just keep going along, should they hold out on trying to get investment to grow a lot faster? Or do you believe they should get investment to grow a lot faster? And then if they were to go to that angel stage, do you think there's a difference for how a male should approach trying to get connected with angel investors and how a female might go about the networking and getting connected? Because assume we know no one, no angel, and now we want to try and get in front of them.
So I would tell you that any business that can self-fund should. Okay, let me just say that to start. You've probably read that and blah, blah, blah. If you don't need somebody to fund you, don't go to an angel group, don't go to a VC, fund it yourself, because the reality is it's going to be a dilutive process. That's what's going to happen. So there's sort of the two different approaches, right? There's a sort of, we raised a little friends and family, now we're going to go out for $1 million, and then we're going to really prove it, and then we're going to go get $5 million. And then there's we're going to be really lean, we're going to get 400,000 of friends and family, we're going to build what we can, really prove it, really penetrate a whole lot of neighborhoods, whatever the metric might be, and then we're going to go out and raise $5 million, okay? And it's really hard. It really depends on how you're approaching your business. It depends on what the size ultimately is of a business like that and what the size of the opportunity is. It depends on how virally it can grow, how hands-on. Do you have to walk into every store and get them to adopt your product? I don't mean to evade your question, but those are the kinds of things that one would want to look at to see how sort of algorithmically driven it is versus human labor it is. Those are all factors that are in the. I don't have a particular feeling about whether it's better for a man or a woman to go. I do think, and this has been said to me by companies, women-led companies I've been involved in, that when they've gone to VCs, company where 3 women co-founders, and they wish they brought a guy with them. Okay, because they were in a room of just male VCs, and whatever, on Sand Hill Road, and the guys were like, okay, and if there'd been a guy there, it would have just worked differently. Exactly true. Okay, so on the other hand, one could argue, clearly if you come to a Golden Seeds, we want the woman to do the presenting, not the guy. All right, assuming, by the way, that it's not like she owns 2% of the company, but you're having her present, but she's seriously your co-founder. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And just quickly, have you ever found any advantages as a female in the growth and investment process?
Sure, I think that there are certain industries in which having, again, to the extent, I mean, it's hard to, I would, for example, if you talk about fashion stuff, let's say, for the sake of argument, I think that there's a lot of domain expertise that's really useful when you think about fashion, okay? Whether it's an understanding of how sort of convoluted the retail market is and how distribution works, sourcing product, from fabric on down, on up the pipeline. So I think that and again, there just tend to have been women in those industries. So I think that those become advantages in terms of, areas. But again, I don't feel that in a gender way. On the other hand, if there's a CTO who's a woman who's just, has her accolades and has built incredible technology, I love that too. And by the way, I think there is an interest in seeing more of that. I would say to your question before, there may be sometimes when we see a woman CTO, we're really eager for it to work. Okay, we might we want it to work out because, again, we want to see more of that. We want more role models. We want more opportunities for women in those positions. And by the way, I said this earlier. I think that we're seeing more of that in the biosciences, clearly, than we are seeing. So we've seen a lot of companies in which, devices are being built and, B2B applications where people you need to understand those markets. You need to have lived it and seen where the pain point is. And women are just more represented there. So it's changing.
Margot, could you introduce yourself and what you do first, and then ask your question?
I was thank you for the opportunity. I am a former entrepreneur, now a partner in an investment fund that invests in startups in rural communities. And we have one incubator now, but the goal is to have it in multiple locations. So I loved your answer about when to put on the gas, because that was one of the tragedies of my entrepreneurial experiences, that we turned down the money at the wrong time, and the wheels fell off and we went into the ditch. So I was actually curious about if you had any sort of really profound sort of tragedy stories, or
War story.
lessons learned. Because certainly I know that I bring to our incubator, and as do my partners, lots of stuff that we're trying to help people avoid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, again, without evading the answer, I think that it's complicated sometimes. There are certain things in which it just doesn't take a lot of money to do it and prove it, all right? There are other things in which you really need a sales force, and you're doing something that's sufficiently innovative that you need to create a demand where people don't understand there would be a demand. It doesn't come naturally. And so you need dollars, whether it's for SEO or for some form of just traditional advertising. I'd rather not sort of name things, but sure, there have been examples of things that I've been involved in that were basically that we starved the entrepreneur, okay, and that even if they'd raised an extra $500,000, and this is something that, again, I think that sometimes women don't ask for enough, and so what happens is that, well, I can do it this way, and because they've gotten so little. They don't have the opportunity to pivot. They don't have a chance to say, oh, God, we had these learnings. Okay, we have an extra $500,000 or $2 million. We can change the business to this, correct? And instead, they go out of business. And I think that that's one of the things, certainly you see that in the Valley, right? I mean, you just see these things that are being funded that are raising millions of dollars on an idea. And they can try over and over again, or they can spend their $5 million to get 50 million users. Well, once you've got 50 million users, it doesn't matter if you've made any money or not, right? As we've seen over and over again. Now you have a market position, a significant position in which your valuation goes up, and now you can raise 25 million, right? So it's very hard to answer, but certainly I do think there is a tendency, and I've seen this certainly among women-led companies, to underfund and to not be given, and again, it sort of relates to the idea before of having a big vision, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think you have a big vision, you know you're going to have to make a dozen mistakes before you get there.
It's interesting, as you say those three things, I hear a theme that it resonates just with the Canadian ecosystem because the constraints of capital
Yes.
also sort of lead to those same things that people complain about. People don't develop a business plan that really needs $5 or $10 million rather than $500,000, and people don't have a big enough vision. You know, they're dealing with constraints or those kinds of things. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question would be, and I apologize if that question is kind of weird for some people who are educated in finance and in investment. I'm totally off that topic. I'm an entrepreneur, but I never deal with investments. Always put my own or kind of family funds into my business. So, is there any golden rule, modern golden rule in your kind of investors' world? How much me as a company, when I'm approaching the investor, potential investor, how much to ask? Let's say, and what are you looking for? Like, let's say, if I have a 100,000 annual revenue, then how much would be reasonable for me to ask to invest, and in exchange to how much of the shares of my company would it be reasonable?
So, again, I don't mean to evade your question, but to the extent that it really is a dynamic, I mean, you may have $100,000 in revenue, but you have some profoundly awesome technology, right, that requires significant investment to go and, you know, to B2B play, and you really need enough money to hire some serious sales and business development so that you can, all right, and the only reason you have 100,000 is because you haven't had the opportunity to do that, right? So it's really hard to answer that question. I think that there are some, and I don't know if the studies have been done that this type of business needs this, and it is so case by case.
No, I mean, ethically, for me to approach you, not to scare you off, like, what would be measures how much to ask in an exchange? Like, because I have to approach you with a proposition first, I guess, right? Please give me $1 million because last year I get a revenue 100,000, but my technology worth $5 million. And so give me $1 million in exchange to 10%.
Well, look, so when people do due diligence, for example, okay, part of the due diligence is somebody will come in to a Golden Seeds or to another angel group. Some people come in and they say, my value, you know, my pre-money valuation is negotiable. Okay. Some people come in and they say, this is what it is. I've gone out in the marketplace and I've seen comparables, and this is what, and sometimes, and certainly this is true at Golden Seeds, and I know it's true at other angel groups, that ends the discussion, all right? If somebody has no flexibility and no give on their valuation, for whatever reason, because they've raised money before, and they don't want to see a down round, because whatever the reason, because they're tenacious and just believe that this is worth what it's worth, that's a really important factor. And to the extent that part of the due diligence is to see what are comparables out there now? What is the potential of this? What is, all right, that would justify the pre-money valuation that somebody comes in with?
What are the qualities that women have that will make them more successful, that will give them a better chance to succeed? That's my first question. And then I will have a second question for you, which is, you mentioned that the inability to find a technological founder is one of the big things that most women have. So is there any tool, any resources that women entrepreneurs can look to in order to bypass the need to find a technological founder?
So let me answer your second question first, because there are certainly, and I know in New York, there's, you know, women who code, there's women in technology. I mean, there are organizations out there now where women who do have these skills are trying to support other women, and I know some women entrepreneurs have gone to those resources to
Geeks TO, right?
Girl Geeks TO.
Yeah, right. So, you know, just where there are women who are developing that technical expertise and understand the businesses and are, you know, want to work with women. So, and then I think that there are other instances. I mean, there are groups. You know, you go to meetups, you go to this, you go find people. And you ask one person to introduce you to somebody else who has the technical or may have built it somewhere else and now wants to replicate what they've done and advance it. So it's sort of like anything else, really. It requires that sort of textured conversation and putting yourself out there and then finding the match. I think I don't think that women are less ambitious than men or any of that.
I don't think so either.
Yeah, I don't think so at all. But again, I think that part of what's changing is what the measure of success is around fulfilling an ambition. So I can tell you that for me, for example, well, yes, I want to be financially successful. It was, I tell the story. I mean, when Esther and I were working together, I get these calls from these headhunters. You want to go work at Microsoft, go work at IBM. And it was like, okay, so I could go work there, and I could make about the same amount of money, and I'd have absolutely no control, and I would never see my children, and I'd be in an airport 75% of my time. Gotta go, all right? I mean, it was just like, so I made the choice that I made, because to me, that would be the measure of success, okay? And I have 2 adult daughters, and I couldn't be prouder, all right? And now those were the choices I made, and something about my personality, I wanted to be independent, and I wanted to be, so I think that's part of what women need to do for themselves. There are some women who, I think that corporations now are beginning to understand that they do need to innovate, and there are probably some great opportunities for women in companies to lead innovation within corporations, because maybe they need that balance of both being entrepreneurial and innovative with some degree of security, that balance. So I think it's a very individual decision, but I don't think that we have to accept the sort of previously incarnated measure of success. I think we can be ambitious, but we need to figure out what the goal is and what it looks like. And I think that's a very individual and personal decision.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because I myself work in 4 countries. I work in France, in Paris, that's where I started my career. I work in Hong Kong, I work in Canada and Toronto, and I work in Canary Wharf in London. I'm a CFA, and I work for Morgan Stanley.
Yes.
What I was driving at is, okay, women have a lot of limitations, but at the same time, women also have a lot of advantages. I was just reading a book by Bill Ehrlich from MIT, and one thing that really struck me was he was saying that, in a sense, entrepreneurship is all about being able to commercialize either your idea or someone else's idea. And isn't it marketing? Isn't it something that women is very good at doing? How can women leverage what we are good at doing in order to break out? That's my point.
So I just want to make one other point, because I agree with what you're saying, but I also think that the world is changing a lot, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot and just work that I've been doing. But in the U.S., this is a big discussion, and I'm sure it is here too. What are 21st century skills that are needed? And again, I'm an eternal optimist, so I would like to believe that some of what we might think of as sort of native female characteristics, right? Whether that's just by experience and for whatever reason, working in teams, collaborating, ideation in a certain way. I mean, that these are characteristics that I don't think that men don't have those characteristics. I think that culture has sometimes, nurtured that in women more. Those, I think, are skills that are being rewarded now. So you can't, nobody, in the tech world, nobody wants to work for that, tyrannical, the entrepreneur and the boss who's just a jerk and horrible, and I'll go to the other startup. I don't need to, right? So I think that those environments and those work cultures where people, are driven to work hard and to succeed, but are looking where you create a culture where the measure of success is some balance between individual and group success as a measure of success and then reward, are values that will be increasingly matter in the workplace. I also think, just by the way, that there's another opportunity, which is something I'm also particularly interested in, which is just these platforms where people will independently be working. So people may not start a company, and they may not, but they will be entrepreneurial. My interest in, for example, a company like a Style for Hire was, I know that in the U.S. there are women who, are fashionistas. They want to make a living going out and shopping on behalf of other people, right? What a great gig, if that's what you're interested in. And there's some way that sort of, how do you create that and turn that into a professionally rewarded skill in which you would need to be entrepreneurial, but you might work independently. Okay, and there we'll be seeing more, as we know, more and more the task rabbits, where people are, and so I think that's a lot of what's happening in terms of these enabling technologies, and everybody has to be entrepreneurial, right? Everybody has to make their LinkedIn page a marketing exercise, right? So I think, again, those are skills that increasingly are just part of the mainstream culture. They're not, so.
Why don't people know about the Daphne Kisses of the world? And when I was introducing you and I mentioned Esther's name, I mean, there were only a half a dozen people who knew who
Who she
Esther,
was.
who she was.
Well, that's a generational thing, partly, I think, and that's.
But why don't people? Maybe a question to you: Who are the top 5 women
Yeah.
in Toronto? Women entrepreneurs. Name them. Show you their names.
Heather
Rising.
Heather.
Ariel
yeah.
Garten.
Yeah, Etrexon company. They have an Etrexon, the CEO of Etrexon.
Okay.
Yeah, Ariel Garden.
Okay.
The-
Who?
Annette for sure.
Okay.
Sally Dawes.
It's because they don't get the media, they don't get the coverage, and they don't get the dialogue.
Right.
Period. If you just look at launch, and I know he's only launched his 5% of his speakers list, but
Right.
the entire lineup is men. Entire lineup. It's unacceptable. And as long as we keep paying our money and showing up to these shit shows, we will continue to get the same shit.
Well, you know, all the years that Esther and I ran our conference, I mean, it was always a mandate that we had to try and invite women. And, you know, we still send emails back and forth about how, you know, in those early days, we invited, what's her name? Ann Livermore, who now runs, you know, it's like, and she was running some, like, you know, quiet division at HP that was like worth $10 billion.
Just a little thing.
So we would invite her to a panel, and 5 years later, she's the CEO of the company. Same thing with Romney. I mean, you know, at IBM, it was the same thing. She ran a piece of IBM, and now she runs the company. And that we literally had to go find those women, and it was always a challenge.
Yeah.
Again, particularly in the tech world, and in the world in which we were talking about really from a technology perspective. But we're happy now that we see that these women, again, time has passed, and these companies understand that these are the right leaders. I think for many, you know, and again, being involved in a lot of accelerators and seeing what happens after the fact. By the way, I believe in accelerators. I think they're really important for those that can get in. I think they really.
In New York, what's the percentage that an accelerator normally takes?
I have no idea what that stat would be, but I will tell you there are a lot of accelerators in New York. And some of them are, you know, they have a thesis, many of them. Now, because these industries have gotten so big, there are some accelerators that are only focused on education, on fintech, on health, that are very sector specific, and then there are others that are more general. You know, Techstars and ERA, those remain pretty general. They're very competitive, but if you can get into one of those, it's really, I think it's more often than not really worth it, because it's a very efficient way to both really have your business be challenged, to benefit from peers, and then to get the opportunity to be in front of investors, who you don't have to go finding or scrambling and finding for yourself, and one thing leads to another. So I think that getting an MBA in this day and age is not, what's the best MBA? Is do a startup, okay? I mean, in some sense, right? You know, it's like anything else. I mean, what's the best way to learn about art is to make art. I mean, it's, you know, so, but again, I think that in terms of advisors, there are different kinds of advisors. Right? There are advisors who have experience in the field you're in. And then there are really great advisors who are experienced entrepreneurs, where the business itself is secondary, but have some really valuable learnings to teach you about how to go from being a 2-person founding team to 5 people, how to build options so that early on you can build the culture and the community that you want. And, you know, and I think that's something that investors look at in terms of having done that work that is part of building the infrastructure that's going to let you grow. So, again, I hope I'm not evading your, but it's all nuanced, but these are all factors that play into it.
So the last question going to Heather.
Wow. And there are some benefits, I guess, of being a co-sponsor. Anyways, first I just want to say, Daphne, I'm sure you'll all agree, and I know you're going to close it off, but just from my end of things, a fabulous talk so far. Thank you. I was just my last question was really going to be about incubators and accelerators and how whether or not you thought they really added value. And you've talked a little bit about that just now, but in the States there are, I think it's 2,300 accelerators and incubators. There's 23 in the GTA. They're growing all the time. In fact, we had an internet bubble or an I bubble. Are we in an E bubble? And what do you think will happen in 5 years from now? Will those kinds of things still be around, or what do you think will happen to this space?
I think that there are, one could argue there are too many accelerators. It really depends where. I think that there are probably, it sort of was interesting because I think it sort of got concentrated in the San Franciscos and the New Yorks and so on. I think probably a lot of those accelerators now are in local communities. And that potentially is a great, the ecosystem that an accelerator offers is an awesome concept, right? People have an idea. It doesn't all have to be about mega technology. It could be around, a local business that creates a sustainable kind of, method and locally driven way in which you could create other entrepreneurs and create retail opportunities and incentivize the community to engage with those products and all of that. So I think that there are ways in which that accelerator model is hopefully here to stay. I do think there's a lot of redundancy in some of these accelerators, and now the accelerators, they're funds themselves. So they're competing. They have investors who are waiting for an ROI. They follow the VC model in the sense that they need, just 1 out of 10 needs to hit. And I think that there's probably a lot of success that those are having. In terms of the people who are in them and their personal success, I don't think it's all that efficient, really. Because again, I really do think that we see a lot of ideas that they're just so incrementally differentiated from one another. Just so minor in some way that, and they're trying to fill a little niche rather than a bigger niche that if they sort of came together they could do. So I think there are opportunities there. So I think you will see sort of a, as we've seen otherwise, kind of a roll-up of some of this stuff. Who the winners will be, I think it's, again, those accelerators are startups themselves. So I think they'll be, so I don't know what it'll look like in 5 years. I do think that the culture in general that supports this is here to stay. And I think that I have seen everywhere I've been, in cities in the U.S. and so on, everybody's trying to figure out some sort of economic development piece that supports it. So I was in Detroit last year, and there, again, you have cities. Not everybody can move to Park Slope in Brooklyn. Okay, there are people that my daughter went to Oberlin College in Ohio. I just got this thing, the cover from the Oberlin Alum magazine is about Cleveland now as a place where people are, they're finding industrial space that they can convert and afford. They're starting coffee shops. They're starting businesses. They're using 3D printing. They're doing, so I think in some way, at scale, we have the opportunity to get local again in some way, and people are going to make those decisions for economic and lifestyle reasons.
Cool. Awesome.